What issues is your company actually addressing when we address the question to firms? And as you can see, customers and marketers agree that the number one purpose companies should promote is being a good employer with pay equity and fair employment practices. That's mentioned by 34% of consumers, and nearly half of the companies say that they actually are pursuing this goal. And fair employment practices ranks number one for most consumers, including those at all income levels, whites, millennials, Gen Xers, and boomers. And it's true in most categories of businesses as well, whether we look at them by size, customer, or consumer type. In fact, if we look at the chart beyond that level, what we see is that consumers are pretty woke. After fair employment, they say companies should promote racial equality, corporate citizenship in their communities, and environmental sustainability. Racial equality is mentioned by 26% of consumers, corporate citizenship, 25, sustainability also by 25. So those really represent the top four purposes that firms are urged to respond to by consumers. What we also see is that companies are responding to a considerable degree. Beyond being a good employer, racial equality is mentioned by 36% of firms, corporate citizenship by 44%, sustainability and environmental impact by 39%. And one other high priority for employers, higher in fact than for consumers, is DE&I, diversity and equity in inclusion in the workplace, which is cited by 40% of firms and 15% of employers. 15% of consumers. If we look beyond the top four, the next ones that come up in consumer concerns are voting rights and democracy, mentioned by 20% and by nearly a third of firms. Women's rights, mentioned by 16% of consumers and 35% of companies. DE&I, as I mentioned. Then criminal justice reform, which came up intensely in the wake of the George Floyd killing, mentioned by 13% of consumers and 29% of firms. And finally, lesbian, gay, transsexual, queer, and other issues, mentioned by only 5% of consumers, but by 27% of firms. So something we see, in fact, is that in many respects, firms may be ahead of consumers in terms of their focuses on purpose. Pardon me a moment. Okay, now we broke down these priorities further, looking at different generations of consumers. And when we did, we saw some interesting findings. First of all, Gen Z stands out as more focused on racial and environmental justice as corporate priorities than their elders. If you look at the far left column, in fact, the top priority for Gen Z is racial equality, followed by sustainability, DEI, and women's rights. What's particularly interesting is that for the three older generations, being a good employer is the top priority, whereas that and corporate citizenship do not figure in the priorities of Gen Z consumers. In other words, if your brand is selling to Gen Z, you should be thinking more about race, green issues, inclusion, and women. On the other hand, good employer is the top issue for the three older groups. Corporate citizenship also figures for all of them in different positions among the top four. Sustainability is also mentioned by all three. So those, for older consumers, cross-sectionally would be the key concerns. Race equality is mentioned again by millennials and by Gen X. It figures much less, interestingly enough, for boomers. On the other hand, the boomers are the only group to list the protection of democracy among their top four concerns. So this gives you some sense of some of the different things you would need to look at depending upon the age of your consumer base. However, we also saw there were some interesting differences by race and ethnicity. If you look at white consumers, who represent the majority, a little more than 60% nowadays, you'll see that their priorities are similar to those of the overall general population, of which they form the bulk. Thus, most important to them is being a good employer, followed by corporations giving back to the communities and consumers whom they serve, sustainability, and also racial equality. On the other hand, for racial minorities, for Black and Latino Americans, there is no question what's the top issue. They feel companies should be addressing the question of racial equality. Racial injustice is very much on the minds of minority consumers. And that's something you need to be aware of if you're appealing to them. Then for Black consumers, after racial equality comes DE&I, which is really racial equality in the workplace. After that, they mention being a good employer and corporate citizenship. Now, for Latinos, the situation is a little bit different. Although their big focus is racial equality, followed by being a good employer, after that, they focus on sustainability, which ranks higher with Latino consumers than it does among Blacks. And they're also the only one of the three groups to say that women's rights is one of the top priorities companies should be addressing. Note that we did not include Asians, not because of a lack of interest, but simply because of a lack of numbers. The subsample of Asians that we had in our overall national sample is too small to allow meaningful analysis, an error that we hope to correct in the future. But here you see once again that not only does age matter, generation also matters. The kinds of purposes your company should be promoting and the kind of activities that your companies should be describing to consumers vary according to their race, according to their generation. Now, one issue we looked at in some detail is the question of support for democracy itself and for voting rights. And we saw some interesting differences among consumers, again, by generation, and among companies by firm size. Now, in the case of support for companies acting to protect democracy, this increases directly with age. Thus, it's only 8% among Gen Zers, 17% among millennials, 19% among Gen Xers, and then reaches its highest level among baby boomers at 27%. So again, this tells us what's on people's minds in terms of the priorities companies should be addressing. When it comes to company size, we found that the smaller firms were less likely to stick their necks out than the larger ones. About 1 in 4 of firms with under 500 employees said that their company is actively addressing this issue. Whereas of the larger firms, those with 501 or more employees, 40% say they were trying to reduce barriers to voting and protect democracy. This is an interesting issue because those larger firms also presumably are less locally rooted and less likely to respond to immediate local pressures from particular advertisers, marketers, or consumer groups. Now, interestingly enough, we found a different pattern for support for women's rights. As I mentioned earlier, Latinos were the one ethnic group that tended to be more favorable to them. More generally, what we found was that women, younger people, and low-income consumers were the ones who stressed promoting women's rights. Now, we were a bit surprised by this because we expected support for democracy and support for women's rights to go hand in hand. But in fact, it didn't work that way. We found there were a specific set of groups we see here were more focused on companies promoting democracy, and other groups, women, the under 35s, and people at the lower income levels, under 25K or 25 to 50K per year, were the likeliest to say companies need to be doing more to advance women. So I've talked a good deal about what people think company priorities should be, but this is, after all, a digital marketing convention, and we're marketers here. And the question, therefore, we also need to ask is, what difference does it make? And we began to try to answer that here by looking at the impact of purpose on purchasing intentions. We asked consumers, how much likelier are you to buy from a company if you think that company is purpose-driven? We are not presenting the results of likelier here. Why? Because 80 or 90% were saying that. It was almost meaningless. It's almost a universal thing. So instead, on the right side of the chart, you see only those consumers who said they are much more likely to buy from purpose-driven companies. What we see here is that it really depends on their income. In terms of the under 25K group, only 15% say they can do that. Those who get $25,000 to $50,000 a year in household income, 1 in 4 says that. Those in the middle of the income scale, from 50 to 125,000, 1/3 say they can do that. Only in the highest income group, those who get 125K, those at 125K or more are likelier to much more likely rather to buy from companies they view as purpose-driven. And we see that phenomenon top boxing as much more reliable as an indicator of real sentiment. So in other words, again, luxury brands, those that are appealing to the highest income consumers, are the ones who have customers who are most likely to respond to this. In the case of companies, we asked what their perception of consumers was as well. And here we found an interesting difference between companies growing at different rates. Of the slower growing companies, those who were growing at 0 to 10% or 11 to 15% a year, only around 2 in 5 said that they felt that their consumers were much more likely to buy from purpose-driven companies. On the other hand, the companies that are doing best, those that are growing at 15% or more per year, found that 2/3 of their marketers said purchasers are much more likely to buy if our company is purpose-driven. So in other words, purpose-driven companies are the ones who are, companies with the highest proportion supporting purpose-driven marketing are also the likeliest to be the highest growth companies as well. Okay, now we looked also at the willingness of consumers to pay more for purpose-driven goods. And here you see the breakdowns both by income and by generation. And by income, again, not too surprisingly, the willingness to purchase is proportionate to income. In other words, 34% of the poorest consumers under 25K a year, say that they would be willing to pay more. 48% of those in the 25 to 50K group, 53% of those in the middle, from 50,000 a year to 125,000, and fully 64% say that in the highest income group. By generation, on the other hand, we see something that is inversely proportional to age. Thus, of Gen Zers, 70% say they're willing to pay more. Of millennials, 63%. Of Gen Xers, half. And of boomers, only 24%. Again, what are the takeaways? Well, here, if your consumers are either middle income or upper income, odds are that they may be willing to pay a premium for goods and services that can be connected to corporate purpose. On the other hand, in generational terms, the consumers who are most concerned about that are, not surprisingly, Gen Zers and millennials, although there's also a substantial proportion of Gen Xers who are interested in this. We find something similar, by the way, with the findings on corporate image. We find that they're also significantly improved if a company is seen as purpose-related. But the figures were similar enough to those I've already presented that we didn't think it was necessary really to show a separate slide on that. So here we see marketers' perceptions of consumers' willingness to pay more. Specifically, the willingness to pay at least 10% more for a product driven with purpose. One of the interesting things we found is that it's quite related to the industry. Thus, the expectation among marketers was smallest in retail, which tends to be fairly competitive and price-driven. And it was almost as low in business services. And this is a case also where people tend to be focused not so much on corporate purpose as they are either on price or on their relationship with the service provider. The numbers start getting higher when we look at consumer durables, where we found that, in fact, the purchasing a major item, a refrigerator, a car, home technology, or that sort of thing, tended to reflect corporate purpose a bit more. Interesting enough, producer goods, companies that were selling largely B2B products, was fairly high. In this case, we find also because they are probably less answerable to politically driven backlash to these sorts of things. Interestingly enough, it was by far highest on consumer non-durables and consumer services. Consumer non-durables, in other words, fast-moving consumer goods, packaged goods, etc. These things are, interestingly enough, very closely watched by consumers in terms of their purpose. And most of all, and this was a surprise, consumer-oriented services, which we saw, which would be various sorts of services, whether cleaning, legal, other things that are related to the individual. These, on the other hand, were very driven by the willingness to pay a premium was very driven by purpose, in this case, according to the people who are in consumer services themselves. Again, we also found a relationship to growth rate. Thus, of companies that were the slowest growing, less than 10% increasing revenue every year, only 1/3 felt their consumers would be willing to pay at least 10% more for purpose. That was half of those 10 to 15% a year. Of the fastest growing firms, on the other hand, almost 3 in 5 felt that their consumers would pay a 10% or more premium for goods produced with purpose. So once again, we see that it is the fastest growing firms who also tend to have the consumers who are most willing to pay more for purpose. So what are the bottom lines of this? Well, I'm going to try to pull together what all this means in terms of their implications. What it means is that you need to segment your consumers and understand your consumer base quite well by generation, by race or ethnicity, or by income. Generation Z, in particular, has the most distinctive orientation. It's focused on social and environmental justice. Their top priorities are race equality, sustainability, DEI, and women's rights. They're the least likely to expect companies to promote democracy. However, they are more likely to fewer are more likely to be based on purpose than millennials or Gen Xers, but those who can afford to would pay somewhat more for the products of purpose-driven firms. Second, if you look at millennials and Gen X, their priorities remain those of the general population. They do, after all, form the largest part of the general population. They're the likeliest to buy from purpose-driven firms. The majority of millennials and half of Gen X also say, as we just saw, that they buy a premium for the products of such firms. Now, baby boomers are nearing the end of their working lives, at the end of our working lives. They're focused on the workplace, and they're less liberal than their younger selves, or for that matter, than today's younger generation. They have the strongest focus on companies that are good employers. They're also the only generation to view promoting democracy as one of their priorities, but they place the least emphasis, surprisingly, on companies promoting women's rights of all the generations. And they're also the generation least likely to buy from purpose-driven firms or to pay a premium for their products as well. So that's the outlook by generation. Now let's look at it by racial and ethnic minorities. In terms of blacks, they're very much at the sharpest edge of racial inequalities, and black consumers focus on racial justice. Their top priorities for companies are promoting racial equality in the society at large and diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Those are followed by being good employers and corporate citizens. Now, formerly disenfranchised, blacks are the groups who stress promoting democracy and voting as corporate goals more than any other set of consumers. They're the least likely to emphasize sustainability in the environment, on the other hand. The black consumer is not necessarily a green consumer, but they're the most willing of any of the racial groups to pay more for products with purpose. If we speak of Latinos, they fall somewhere in between black and white in their views of corporate purpose, as on many other issues as well. They say that the top priority for companies like blacks is promoting racial equality. Next come being a good employer and promoting the environment. And they're the only group to put promoting women's rights among their top purposes for corporations. Finally, if we segment by income, what do we find? Well, in terms of the higher income group, over 125,000, that's the top fifth of consumers, they're the most likely by income to say that companies should promote democracy and voting rights. They're also the only group where the majority is much likelier to buy from companies with purpose and will pay more for the products of such companies. If we look at the middle income groups, we find that many are much more likely to buy for purpose, but not the majority, and many will also pay more for products with purpose. And finally, if we look at the low income group, those who are under 25,000, they're the least likely to want firms to promote democracy. Few are much more likely to buy from purpose-driven firms, and they're also the least likely to pay more for purpose-driven products. Finally, since we conducted this research, I should mention that there has been another important issue which has arisen, which implies, with big implications for corporations on purpose. And that, of course, is the war in Ukraine, where Russia has invaded its next door neighbor. And there's been some interesting research on this project, on this topic. What it found was that fully half of American consumers expect companies to have denounced the Russian invasion of Ukraine and also to demonstrate their opposition to it. Now, when you look at their expectations for individual categories of firms, what you find is that they are most likely to expect this from companies that do international business. So international finance, airlines, major exporters of technology, or those sorts of things are the ones where as many as 3/4 of consumers say, you've got to distance yourself. On the other hand, in other cases, things like, say, local laundromats, local supermarkets, local grocery chains where products are neither sourced from Russia to any large extent or sold to Russians, except perhaps at Brighton Beach, the expectations are much lower. But if you see a firm as having a national or international profile or consumer base, then the expectation seems to be this is something they need to be doing. Now, what they need to do obviously needs to be related and sensible. There was a case where Applebee's placed a wonderful, delightful advertisement about how great things are at Applebee's next to grim stories of massacres in Bucha. That one did not go over well, and in fact, it went viral for all the wrong reasons. Likewise, Kylie Jenner managed to put her foot in it as well with a wonderful commentary that also went viral for the wrong reasons. The Jenner family seems to have this difficulty, if you recall what happened after the killing of George Floyd as well. So what's also important is, in other words, that the commitment that you make on Russia or on any other issue related to purpose has to be one that makes sense for your brand and one that's going to redound well with consumers. So above all, I would say if there's one takeaway from this, it is if you want to discuss purpose, know thy consumer. You need to understand who they are. Today's presentation is meant to give you a flavor of how different groups of consumers react to this issue. But you need to look at the specific customers or consumers that your company has and see what their expectations are in terms of purpose. But purpose itself matters. So that's my prepared remarks. Let me ask now if there are any questions, comments, reactions, or people who think I'm insane. There's someone over there. Please wait for the mic. Can you pass the person behind you?
Just curious, could you speak to the sample size and participant selection for this study, as well as how you define perceptions of purpose?
Oh, of course, yes. We had samples of 500 customers with quotas to ensure accurate representation of the different racial groups of Americans. And we had 411 marketers. And in this case, it was quotas to ensure a distribution of firms of different sizes because we didn't want to have all small firms or all large ones for that matter. So I'm going to wait just a moment until the mic gets to you because we all want to hear you.
I think we can all hear me, right?
But not the ones who are listening online.
Yeah. Okay. So you were mentioning that you made sure to have the appropriate data sets for racial groups. However, I was very intrigued by the data that you showed regarding consumers' interest in LGBTQ plus community related purpose.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you also ensured that the data set has included diversity in that regard.
We didn't, and that may be something we ought to look into in future. Partly, as I suspect you know, it's a sensitive question to ask, and you have to be very careful how you ask it. The other issue is right now, it's a little unclear what the quotas should be. Because if you look at older generations, for example, and previous surveys, only around 3 or 4% of Americans would say they were LGBT, etc. On the other hand, now, you'll get, especially among Gen Zers, as many as 20% saying that. So that's why it's an issue. But the other question is, what is the right number to put in? But I think that's something we need to pay some more attention to.
Thank you.
Okay, there's someone here.
Oh. I'm a little afraid to do this.
My first question is that what is the you show the consumer and the company ratios for what they're thinking about and how much they care about a specific topic. You show those.
Sorry, can you say that one again a little louder?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it clear now? Yeah. Okay. You show the graph about the consumer and companies and how much percentage of them care about a specific topic. My first question is that what was the industries and sectors accounted in that research? And the second one is that is it the same companies or same industries, marketers and consumers?
Okay, let me make sure I understand your question. The first was in the marketer sample, which industries were represented? And the
Yes.
second was, were these marketers or purchasers from those industries?
Yes, is it from the same industry or cross industries, the consumers and the marketers?
Okay, well, just to flip back, what you can see across the bottom of the left-hand part are the different sectors that we had represented among the marketer sample. And specifically, we had, in this case, the ones we label as marketers are just that, the marketers of these companies. We also did a separate survey of business purchasers, which will be as part of our B2B release in June. But those are not, for that reason, part of this survey. Although we did find, interesting enough, that B2B purchasers are also pretty woke.
Okay, and for the very first graphs that you showed
Yes.
in your presentation, I was actually asking about that, the topics related to before.
This one here.
Yes. Is it the same companies purchase consumers or the marketers and consumers? There are two lines.
Right.
Are they from the same companies, consumers? Or
No, the consumers are a representative sample of the American public aged 18 or older. The marketers, on the other hand, are, a group drawn from the different segments that we just looked at.
I just wanted to know if there was like a direct correlation between industries.
No, there is not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, in that case, let me wrap up by briefly saying, if you would like to see, there is a written up report on this subject, and you can get it either from the address that's up there, or from charneyresearch.com, or if you would care to give me your business card, or send me an email after this event, we'll be happy to send you a PDF for that as well. And let me thank you all for your patience and your interest in this topic.